Hi, I'm Mika, and I'm a first-year character animation student at the Animation Workshop. I wanted to make this video going over my portfolio and sort of unpacking my thoughts about the application process. One of the older students already made a video like this a couple of years ago, and I found it to be such a good resource that I wanted to contribute my own thoughts as well, and hopefully this video can also be helpful. This was my third time applying, and I want to go through the categories, touching upon what I learned during this 3-year process, shouting out some of the resources I used along the way. The first thing that the reviewers see about your portfolio is the cover letter, and this is your first chance to show your personality. And I did it by doing a little portrait of myself. It's absolutely not mandatory. You can do whatever you want with this first page, and it's completely an option just to not do anything, but it is a way for you to show who you are from the get-go. The first real category is the letter of intention, and this is a very important part of the portfolio. So the point is for the reviewers to get to know you and to see that you are suitable for this education. You have to be sure that this specifically is what you want, and you want to explain why you specifically want this. Why do you want to do animation, and why do you want to be in this school specifically? One really important thing to consider is how do you work in a group, because this school, this field, this industry is highly collaborative and you need to be able to work with people. Consider how is it for you to work surrounded by people who are working on the same thing? Does it give you energy? Do you enjoy having different perspectives on your work? Do you seek out feedback? Do you give out feedback? Is it a positive thing for you? Another thing that they look for is life experience. You could be a great artist straight out of high school, but if your letter of intention shows a very clear lack of maturity, they're probably not going to consider you. Which might sound harsh, but it is vital, especially if you're moving in from outside of Denmark. You should be honest and transparent about your thoughts and feelings, and don't be afraid to tell personal stories in your letter of intention. I think it can be immensely helpful to open up and to allow the reviewers to get an honest picture of yourself. You can also have fun with the letter of intention visually. Like I did this whole animation paper thingy, so I put effort into the presentation, and I included a little me as a waiter to tell to the reviewers that here's this dish that I've prepared. Have fun with the entire portfolio. Now the first drawing category is life drawing. And the first thing you gotta do here are the long studies. And this is a pretty intimidating part of the portfolio, but don't overlook how important it is. I think you should go out of your way to seek in-person sessions instead of drawing from photographs. You are allowed to draw from photographs, but there are certain benefits to in-person sessions that you cannot get just from drawing from pictures. What's really important in the long study portion of the portfolio is that you understand anatomy, proportions, and form. And also that you can retain a sense of gesture even with a very long and static pose. These are what the reviewers are looking for. My advice is to try your best to understand what you're drawing, both in form and in function. The easiest way to draw long studies, in my opinion, is to understand the underlying structure. I think as soon as you understand the 3D building blocks of something and can recreate them reliably from your imagination, drawing becomes so much easier. This doesn't just apply for life drawing, I think it applies for all drawing. For resources for this section, I want to try to recommend them in a manner where you understand the forms from the most major down to the minute and small. What I want to share in the beginning is an online course called Drawbox, which is basically there to get you comfortable with solid drawing forms in space, and understanding and believing that illusion for yourself. I think you should get comfortable with that before you start applying those to human figures. It also helps a lot with line confidence. I think a really good book to get you started is one called Movement and Form by Samantha Youssef. That's one where they break down the major forms of the human body really well, and they also cover life drawing and gesture in a general overview. And when you want to get more specific about 3D forms and anatomy, I recommend some YouTube tutorials by the channel Rake. They break down heads, they break down back muscles, legs, in a really intuitive way where you understand the 3D building blocks and the general rhythms of those parts. And for very, very minor things is a book called Constructive Anatomy by George Bridgman. The actual language in this book is very jargon heavy and I think relatively not that useful. But if you are on that level where you understand how to construct complex or three-dimensional space reliably from your head, it can be a really useful cheat sheet to construct complex things such as the interlocking parts of an arm or a leg or knees. Now this school has a branch called TDA, or the Drawing Academy, and you can see from my rendering and values that I did not go there. I sort of had to learn this on my own, so I don't feel like I'm an authority to give you advice on it. I would probably recommend TDA. The one really good piece of advice that I got from a friend of mine was to limit the number of values I used to a maximum of 4, and then simplifying the shadows on the human body to very major areas. Moving on to Croqui, the most important thing in this category is to capture the flow of the pose, the overall gesture, and you should avoid cutting off any parts of the body. You should try to always include some sort of indication for the hands, the feet. The feet especially are very important for grounding the figure in three-dimensional space. One thing that the reviewers told us is that they basically look at each line as a decision. Like if you're defining a part of the body with several scratchy lines, that signals indecisiveness to the reviewers, and you want to be really decisive with your croquis. You should try to get in a routine where you're doing croquis at least once a week, because it's also a very useful warm-up for drawing the rest of the stuff in your portfolio. One resource that I absolutely want everyone to be aware of is a book called Forced Dynamic Life Drawing, which is a really approachable book that sort of teaches you how to see movement in a single line. Like in a static figure, there's still forces that are at play. There's gravity, there's tension from the muscles that's affecting the flow of the pose. And it's such a natural and approachable way of explaining that I genuinely can't recommend the book enough. I changed how I draw. The next section of the portfolio is called Drama and Acting, and this is all about creating story with poses, expressions, and the composition. What we want in this section is character interaction, and what we want is story. A really useful tip that I got from an alumni was to think, what is the story here? What happened previously? What's going to happen right after this situation? And ideally, you want your audience to also be intrigued by that question. One really good thing to explore in this section is a change in dynamics. You can try telling a story with multiple pictures instead of just one, like what I have with the fairies here, what I have with this mom and her kid, because that creates a lot of interest. You should display a lot of variety in drawing styles in this section, and to that end, playing around with proportions is your friend. You should preferably only include full bodies, because body language is such a vital part of character acting, and omitting the whole figure is sort of a missed opportunity. You only have a few slots, so you should try to go all out. And don't forget the gestural power of hands. If you've already made some busts or expression sheets for your portfolio, you can include them later on in the freestyle or optional sections, but try to reserve this category for full body character interaction. Another tip for this section is to exaggerate as much as you can. Push poses way farther than you would think to do to make the ideas as clear as possible. Try your best to make the emotion read just from the character's silhouette. This is very cartoony and extreme, but it helps to sell the emotion a whole lot. You should also avoid repeating similar expressions and emotions. You can try to avoid that by including a range of different sort of tones and moods. Like you could try doing some horror pieces, some comedy pieces, some drama, and see how you would approach those different emotional states. Also, avoid adding any unnecessary background elements unless they're very vital for the story. Like I have the washing machine here, it wouldn't really read if it wasn't there. But be careful about that, so you're not wasting time on stuff that isn't crucial to get the idea across. One really good resource for coming up with different looking characters and sort of different styles is to look at official character sheets from actual animated productions. A movie like The Road to El Dorado and The Secret of Kells have a completely different way of constructing their characters. They're still technically both believable in three-dimensional space, but the way they approach their construction is wildly different, and it can be very useful to see those different approaches. Also, don't underestimate the value of taking photo reference of yourself. Sure, it's a tad silly, but it can make your expressions and poses a lot more believable. Another resource that I want to share in this category is something called the mask technique, which is very useful for mapping out the features of the face on a 3D plane and sort of making sure that the eyes and the eyebrows and the face works as a unit instead of the parts working separately where it's sort of disconnected. It's a classic animation technique that sells that illusion of the face acting as a whole. There's a really good workshop video that I used to understand this technique, and I'm gonna link all of the resources I mentioned into one big Google Docs that'll be in the description. And the next section is movement. Cool transition that I stole from the previous guy who made a portfolio video. I stole that idea. This is the section where you can implement any previous animation knowledge that you may have. What we're looking for is key poses. So everything basically that makes a good key pose for an animation applies here. Strong silhouette, gesture, squash and stretch. You can basically use a lot of the animation principles and animation tips and tricks to make good movement. What you've learned in Croqui also absolutely applies here. You have to try to capture the energy in the pose, and it's a good idea to include some very loose sketches to see how you simplify, how you get the movement down in just a few confident lines. You should apply a lot of contrast in your poses and ideally be able to sort of feel out the movement from pose to pose. One way that you can help do this is to put your drawings on an animation timeline and flip through them to feel the movement. One thing that you can do as a resource for this section is to go on YouTube videos and step frame them with the period and comma key and sort of look for very strong poses in that movement and do croquis based on that. Like a lot of mine are just basically movement croquis where I applied a character on top of them, like this, and even actually the foxes. Like these red foxes, I took these poses from a video of live foxes playing or biting each other, killing each other. I don't know. Another croquis exercise is to take animated movements and do a sort of animation croquis on them. So again, step framing through it and drawing the line of action, trying to capture the movement as in as few strokes as possible. You should use like a max of 30 seconds to capture a pose, even shorter. Like try doing 10 seconds or 5 seconds and see how much you can get in that short amount of time. The next section is the storyboard, and what we're looking for here are just functional drawings, not pretty drawings or good drawings. Think, what's the best way to tell the story? That's not necessarily the same thing as the most interesting or the coolest way to tell it. What we're going for is clarity. Do a lot of thumbnails. Plan many options and pick and choose the best ones later on. At this stage, only you need to understand what's going on. Then, once you've settled on an idea, do a pass to make things understandable, but not clean. That's important, not clean. Then, show it to your friends and ask them to describe what's happening. If they don't understand, that means you have to go back and change it. Whether it be changing the pose, changing the silhouette, changing the entire composition, like starting the panel from scratch. There might be something that's just not working, and you need to figure out how to get the idea to be clear. Because you can't explain anything to the reviewers. You can't include text that says like, oh, this character is evil. We need to see that they are evil. We need to see the story. But if you show it to your friend and they understand, everything's clear, you showed it to multiple people and they all tell you the same story, the story that you intended, then you can go back and make it slightly prettier if you want to and really have the time. One thing that differentiates animation from illustration is that we rely on very quick comprehension because these images won't be on screen for that long. So you need the viewer to understand what's going on pretty much instantly. What's really important here is the silhouette of your characters, the silhouette of your objects, because you want to make your story read even at a small size. One thing that was immensely useful for me, it was to just put the rule of thirds, the grid, on each one of my drawings in the planning phase already, so that I had very clear focal points in the shots. And I sort of understood what I was going for from the very beginning. You should keep in mind the 180-degree rule, because that's also one that really helps you with clarity. And you should use angles only to enhance the story. Don't do an angle just because it looks cool. It has to serve the story. Same with any camera movements or any of the fancy stuff. Make sure that it's making the story read clear or enhancing the emotion. For example, the reason I have the camera looking up at the captain here is to give them a sense of authority. It's a varied angle, but it also has a story purpose. For resources, you should look at storyboards from official productions, TV and film, and see how they handle notes, camera movement, values, because there's a lot of lingo, there's a lot of shorthands in storyboarding that are used in the industry, and they can be very helpful to convey ideas such as camera movements of objects. Like you see these red arrows everywhere, ins and outs, this nonsense. It's actually supposed to convey something here. There's a lot of good stuff that you can pick up on from looking at professional storyboards. And you can also see the level of cleanness that they have, and it's usually not very clean. Like look at a TV production storyboard. They're usually very loose. They just need to get the idea across. Now for the most spooky, scary part of the portfolio, perspective, which is a headache for a lot of people, me including, but I can tell you that with the 3 years I've applied, I've gotten a lot more comfortable with this category. While you can just include technical studies and whatnot, it's much more interesting if you try to tell a story with your composition. Think, where are we and what's the mood? You should decide on a clear focal point in your drawing and build the composition around to support it. In terms of this piece, I really want the viewer to look in this area. I have the roofs making an invisible leading line down here. There's the most detail. There's a lot of contrast in this area. It was my decision from the start. You can see from my process that I drew these buildings first, and then I started like branching out, adding more buildings and more detail. Same with this indoor piece. I want the focus to be this girl lying on her bed looking at animal magazines, comics, whatever they are. You can see from my process included down here that I started off by just making this bed. This was the sort of focal point of the piece that everything grew around. Including a character in your composition is a plus because it shows that you can place characters confidently and believably in 3D space. Another thing to think about with these is to try and include both organic and rigid structures, rigid forms, because it shows that you have range and it shows that you have confidence in 3D space. Remember to show your process and don't rely too much on ready-made grids. Like, it's best if you can construct everything on your own. I mean, you can definitely still use a line tool and whatnot, but I did a thing where I constructed with the line tool, but when it came to making the final lines, I did them all freehand so that there wouldn't be a contrast between really clean lines and sort of jittery handmade lines. If you have this contrast of very clinical clean lines, obviously made with a ruler, and then organic freehand lines, it can break the illusion of this being a believable space. For resources, I'm gonna suggest drawbox.com. Perspective really is just drawing form and space, and if you learn to construct everything from 3D forms as your default state of drawing, perspective and layout drawing becomes so much more manageable as a result. The theory part of perspective is meant to help, but it's usually taught very separately, sort of as a schematic to follow instead of in a way where you understand and actually believe the forms that you are drawing. But Drawbox is insanely good at bridging that gap between theory and practice, and I genuinely can't recommend it enough. I'm not being sponsored, I wish I was. Another really good resource is a YouTube channel called BAM Animation, and they've made a couple of videos on perspective and layout drawing, and they're really great at breaking down what goes into a layout. You should take inspiration from any interesting objects that you have lying around you, because a lot of these details, the shelves, the weird staircase, those were stuff that were lying around in my actual room. When I went to my grandma's place, I saw some cool objects there and I took a picture of them, and I decided, hey, this would actually be something really cool to include in this piece. because it adds this air of believability. And this cityscape that I had here, this is based on a lot of photo reference that I took, I believe, in Germany. You can also look at official layouts from productions, films, and series. Take inspiration, genuinely. Like, you're not gonna come up with a believable space, like, in terms of decorating the scene from your head. You should draw inspiration from various sources. Final mandatory part of the portfolio, it's freestyle. Could you please work? There you go. You should show a myriad of different drawing styles and explore stories and themes that resonate with you. Draw things that you personally find fun. Like they tell you on the website, but this should be the category where you have a lot of fun with your drawings. I managed to do it by starting to really care about the characters that I was doing, starting to care about the stories. Like this piece, for example, when I came up with the idea that like their companion is a robot, it sort of started a feedback loop where I would think like, oh, why are they a robot? What's their relationship? Did their father die? Did their grandpa build a robot for them to like keep them company? A lot of scenes just popped into my head, and as a result, I had fun drawing this character, and I included another piece in the freestyle section of these characters just because I was inspired by them. That also happened with the panda girl. Like, I drew her here, and it sort of started feeding my mind this story about her, like who she is and what her life is like. So that's why I made this acting piece with her. You should try to actually care about the stories that you're telling. You should let them inspire you, be invested in them, and that way your audience and your reviewers will also be invested. And after the freestyle, you have an optional section. I basically used this section to show some studies that I was still really happy with, like the statue thing, like advanced perspective drawing. Also a really good idea to include some excerpts from your sketchbook, just show what kind of stuff you like to do. Like, I have a lot of just people sketching and doing structures that I found interesting. I even have a photography section in this just to show my interest in composition. There's the character again! You see, I was so excited about their story that I even made a Toon Boom puppet of them. But genuinely, let them inspire you. That's one thing that I think was a major difference between my previous portfolio and this one. It's just, I got immersed into the stories of these characters. They're not that deep, but I was having fun, you know? Also, look at this mess. Look at anyone who knows Toon Boom would like spit at me if they saw this. Then I included some animation examples. Shows that you have a passion for it if you've done it previously. I think the last thing that I have on here is just a message saying thank you in my native language. That's right, I was finished the whole time. So, closing thoughts and general tips. You should start early, obviously, but it bears repeating, and give yourself personal deadlines so that you aren't screwed if you miss them. If one aspect of the portfolio is very difficult for you, you should try doing some of those pieces early on so that you won't have to rush them. Another thing that I want to shout out is PureRef, which is a godsend of the software where you can put all your reference images into and it will retain the resolution. It was vital for my process because I could have all these references of street corners, of different costumes, different movements, just everything that I needed was in the same place on the same screen, and I could just have that open while I was drawing. Another thing that I want to mention is that don't worry if you don't get in on your first try, because every year that you apply is a great chance to hone your skills and grow as an artist. As long as you're seeking out new resources and having a clear goal in your mind, you're guaranteed to evolve and get better as an artist. I've seen the most rapid progression of my art in the time that I've applied. Like, genuinely, there's such a leap from each one of the portfolios that I did. It's a good thing that you have that time to study and grow before you're here, because you do have to be at a certain skill level and just like at a maturity level in your life where you can get the most out of this education. The last thing that I want to mention is if you're excited about a new video like this popping up, there may even be another one in the future because 2 of my classmates are thinking of doing one. And they're really good artists, really cool people. Shout out Nora and Ophelia, and hopefully that video will also exist in the future. It'll be linked in the description once it comes out, and I'm sure you will also like be searching it up on YouTube feverishly, like a top portfolio video, because I did that a lot when I was applying. Genuinely, thanks to Guido for making that original video, because it was great. And hopefully any of my ramblings made sense. Hopefully you got some good resources out of it, and if not, I'm sorry for wasting your time, but if you did, great. Kiitos, and see you at TAW, hopefully.